So in 1492, Columbus sailed, help me out. Didn't that just come to our minds? We have this inscribed up here, a lot of things that are inscribed up there, and they're not always in textbooks, some of this information that's kind of been lost and become a bit on the invisible side. Some of it is playground stuff from my parents and me and kids today and your playground. It's on TV commercials, it's TV shows, it's movies. We learn a lot of things from people who have put stuff together that may not be really accurate information. So if I turn this on, we'll be in better shape. Yes. So I guess part of it is to realize that all Europeans and Indians were peers and co-equals, but then people forgot. Everybody forgot. And it's hurting us now, and I think adding some truth can help to free us a little bit and free us in our outer world, and also free us in our inner world as well too. So just a little bit first about Europe. The population in 1492, Europe, the population was about 70 million people. Now when I talk about the Western Hemisphere, I'm speaking of South America, and Mesoamerica, which is Central America, and North America. So I talk about all the indigenous people from all of those areas and the natives who were here at that time. So the population in the Western Hemisphere has been ever increasing numbers and estimates, settling in at around 100 million. There's estimates still today as low as 50 and as high as 140 million. But around 100 million in Western Hemisphere, 70 million in Europe. The largest city in Europe at that time, 1492, was Paris, around 200,000 people. Largest city in the Western Hemisphere in what today is Mexico is Tenochtitlan, 250,000 to 300,000 people. Now, the world's first apartment complexes, so they built these adobe buildings that would get added onto over time, eventually getting up to 700-800 units in one of these complexes, and that was the most densest populated place on Earth at that time in 1492. The Europeans were not really doing well at that time. Difficult for them to get enough nutrition. 85% of them were serfs, really a little better than slaves, really. It was the kings and queens that ran every country in Europe, and the nobles and serfs and dukes and barons were like little kings and queens themselves. So they had the whole country pretty much divided up, and the average person tried to have livestock. They grew barley and wheat, but they're difficult to grow, and keeping a nutritious diet was very much not something they were able to do in Europe at all. They had a lot of diseases, 12, 13 different diseases that would sweep through in epidemics across Europe, and that they unfortunately traveled around the world as they colonized around the world as well too. Cleaning was something that they did not do, basically. At that point, they just did not clean themselves at all, maybe a few times in their life, once or twice. Queen Isabella, who sent Columbus over in 1492, she bragged about washing herself twice in her whole life. Once when she was born, and once when she got married. And it was almost a badge of honor at that point. Now, they thought that sickness came to us. The way we got sick was by especially immersing ourselves in water, but sickness would come to us through water, would get in through the orifices in our body, and that's how we got sick. And this was definitely backed up by the church, because nakedness was associated with the unclean behavior and these sorts of things. So yeah, the second law that Isabella ever passed as early as 1493 in the New World was against the Indians bathing. They bathed themselves every day, and this was very bad for their health, and they made laws against it and forced them to stop bathing. So I remember one time, we've all met homeless people, but I remember this time, Kiwi W and Dixie coming into a Tim Hortons one time. And this gentleman, and I did not come in through the door that he was beside. I came in another door, and I was maybe 35 feet away from this guy, and I'll never forget that was sort of bringing a homeless person to a new level. So it's hard to imagine that that type of things were just different back then, 500 years ago. 10% of the people in Europe were infirm in some way, handicapped, meaning hunchback, lame, crippled, deaf, dumb, blind, or just plain insane. So 1 out of every 10 people, and this was a combination of just the way they lived, the disease, the lifestyle, and the difficult to have good nutrition. So a little bit more just bracketing for Spain, which is the country that first sent people over. They had been at war for 800 years, and it just ended that very year, in fact. So certainly we know the influence of just being at war for 5 years in the 20th century, but picturing being at war for an entire generation, but 800 years. So that really shapes a culture beyond anything that we can kind of picture ourselves. And so another aspect of something that's difficult for us to relate to today is that class sort of ruled everything at that point. Now, race is what we tend to notice more of today, and of course that's in the news every day, along with Indigenous issues. But class was much more prevalent in terms of ruling the day-to-day lives of people at that point. The nobility and the higher classes associated with the higher classes, and the lower classes associated with the lower classes, and people didn't dream of trying to go outside of their class to associate with people. So when cultures met each other, we've got Asians, blacks, Caucasians, and Indians in the Western Hemisphere, and then subcultures within those. When peoples met each other, they tended to associate by class. And for instance, it was very common for the nobility to want to marry into the nobility of the other culture that they were meeting up with, whether they'd be black, white, Asian, or American Indian. And so I wouldn't say they didn't notice race. They didn't notice it the way we do today. And I think our race issue that we focus on today, I think really is an outgrowth of class that came back from that period. And our visual associations of these people eventually grew over time, and I think gave us some of our opinions we have today about the different races around the world. So in the Western Hemisphere, they had thousands of languages. We don't know the exact amount. There's about 3,500 different territories, call them nations, states, tribes, provinces, villages, towns, cities, all different ways to interpret that, but around 3,500 different distinct territories. And by distinct, I mean they knew their territories. They may have had a different attitude in many of these cultures about actual private property rights compared to Europe, where everything was cordoned off by the noble system they had there. So they may not have had private property in the same sense, but they had territories. They had imaginary lines, just like we do today. They knew where their territory stopped and ended, and the land was all basically taken. And that's something that, when I say has been forgotten over time, that they were peers and co-equals, that's an example of something that's kind of easy to forget. So between 1500 and 1640, so a 140-year period, 1 out of every 5 people on Earth died in Indian epidemics as they were depopulated. So 20% of the population of the Earth were Indians that died in epidemics from disease. I'm going to get into a little bit about what actually happened with these diseases later, like why it was so difficult for them with the disease aspect of things. So that's the largest loss of life on a percentage basis like that. If you take 20%, that's the largest loss of life in human history. The Indians of the Americas did have a huge impact on their environment. It was not all pristine wilderness. They treated their ecology more almost on a continental scale, some of the things that they did, and that's all up and down the whole hemisphere as well too. So the extraordinary gifts of the Indians are not really being taught. They never really have been taught much. It's just a lot of it's been lost. All around the world is the same, not just here or in the Western world, but pretty well everywhere. The image of the Indian has pretty well been destroyed. We picture the savage running around out in the woods with a diaper on has been this image. This seems to persist out there quite a bit. So I'll share a few of these things with you over time, but share these compelling stories yourself. Learn some great stories that you can surprise people with and spread the word. These aren't secrets, for sure. So let's talk about some gifts of invention and innovation, a few. I have a list that I've put over there that fascinated me at the end. If you want to browse through, it's literally a long list of some of the innovations and inventions that over time, not necessarily that they had one civilization that operated all these things at one time, not the way we have today, but different things that had been invented, had been used, that civilizations had come up with. So some of these gifts, for example, well, footwear is a good example. That it was these are all well documented things written by Europeans. When they came over, the footwear, especially in North America, that was used by the Indigenous was quite highly superior. And after a while, as they traveled together, and they did live together a lot at that time, they would get tired of borrowing the extra pair in the backpack from the Indians and eventually start making their own. But the leather, very hard leather boots were not very good for walking. The homes as well too, this is another North American example. The homes in Northern Europe, particularly France and English, they lived in motte and dauble homes. And the Europeans commented on the homes when they came into North American homes, which were bark houses, long houses, different yurts, those type of houses. And the homes in Europe and Northern Europe were very drafty, and they also weren't exactly waterproof either. And those were the two main things that they were able to, Indians were able to contribute those improvements. Medicines, as an example, I'd like to learn more about what they did with medicines and really have a comprehensive list. I know that they certainly gave us many, many of our medicines. Quinine, which fights malaria, which built the Panama Canal, which probably won us the Second World War as well too. But aspirin saved the baby. Many, many medicines, and the 400 years that the white man has dominated these two continents, there's not one medicine plant that they've discovered that wasn't already known to the Indigenous. The vessels, they were water people, because remember at that time there certainly was trails all over the continents in terms of people that were doing walking and running and sending messages, but the waterways were the main tributaries, the highways at that time. So they were very good at their vessels. They were able literally to paddle circles around the European smaller vessels that the Europeans brought over, and that used to be a point where they would tease each other all the time about that. But they also, by the way, learned to make the large ships fairly quickly that the Europeans introduced to them. And sometimes they were sold into slavery, lots of them were, up to 2 million. And sometimes they had to have these ships to go down and rescue their brethren down from in the West Indies. So they were good water people as well too. They gave us rubber, and they had a way of vulcanizing rubber. Rubber's not useful until you do this vulcanizing process, and they used morning glory powder, and they were able to vulcanize rubber. And they weren't just playing games, because when the Europeans first came and saw these balls bouncing, they were afraid. They thought they were alive because they'd never seen anything like that. So they weren't just inventing basketball and soccer in some of these games. They had useful purposes for rubber as well too. They had waterproof clothing, waterproof ponchos, waterproof boots. And now the Industrial Revolution is founded on three main things, which is steel, rubber, and petroleum. Rubber is actually one of the main three ingredients. So I think most of us would have had trouble getting here today without a gift to the American Indian, which is the rubber on our tires as well too. So the Industrial Revolution, which most of our civilization is founded upon, rubber was a huge, huge part of that. And it became a large worldwide industry very, very quickly. So they gave us rubber. The Inca Road is a road system that's in the Andes Mountains. Now, this is something I don't know why this wouldn't be taught to people, because it's just fascinating information. None of this is amazingly difficult to uncover, a lot of this information. It's just that we just have this habit of not making it prevalent. But that's an amazing road system. It's been in place for 600 or 700 years. It's mostly rock. It's still in use today. This is a very long road. In fact, there's two of them. There's one in the mountains and one along the coast. Now, if you stretch this road out, if you moved it to Canada and stretched out this road, it would go from Newfoundland to Vancouver. So it's a formidable road. Or if you're in the States, it would be from New York to Los Angeles. So they had one of these roads up in the mountains, and they had one along the coast. They were close to each other. And then there's all the subsidiary roads in between. Until recently, I was actually teaching that the total number of kilometers in this road system was 25,000 miles, which is 40,000 kilometers. Excuse me. And I would say, what does that sound like? That's the distance around the Earth. So that was the size of their system. But now, through satellite photography, they've discovered the actual total amount of road way within this highway system was 225,000 kilometers of highway. Okay, it's a great accomplishment. They had suspension bridges, 200 suspension bridges, unknown in Europe at that time and not practiced in Europe until the 1800s. They always built 2 suspension bridges. They had cables, 1-foot cables supporting their suspension bridges. They had gondolas. They cut through mountains, of course. They didn't have the pack animals, but they cut through mountains. And the Inca Road is an entire seminar in itself because they ran their empire by the Inca Road. They had runners on it, and it's a fascinating system how all the individual cultures within their empire actually operated the road system, built it, and operated. But yeah, 600 or 700 years it's been completed and still in use today as well too. Pyramids, we hear a lot about pyramids. They had hundreds of pyramids in South America. Now everybody knows about the 3 pyramids in Egypt. I have an 11-year-old son, and I asked him one time, and they're not taught that in school. When I talk about information that's just kind of out there in our society, he knew there was 3. He knew they were in Egypt. He knew the size of them. In South America and Mesoamerica, they have hundreds of pyramids, some of them larger in size than the one that's in Egypt. North America also, they had huge pyramids, hundreds of them. Now in North America, they were called mounds. They were built out of dirt. Many of them are still around today as well and can be visited in North America. Yeah, we just don't happen to know a lot about them. So farming, of course, was the main contribution that the people in the Western Hemisphere gave us. Really, they were certainly very good at farming and developing foods over centuries and over many, many generations. Trade is well established that they had a lot of trade routes going all up and down. South America to Mesoamerica to North America, they had their systems. Corn is a good example because that was initially started in around the middle of the hemisphere. And of course, that's all the way from Hudson Bay right down to the bottom of South America. Corn's been around for thousands and thousands of years. So they had a pretty robust trade system and trade habits. I mentioned balanced diet, and all up and down the hemisphere, they had a very balanced diet. And nobody knew about nutrition or what nutrition was at that time. Europeans, nobody really did, but they had a balanced diet in the Western Hemisphere, and it was mostly because of their farming. Their calendar was more accurate at that time than the European calendar. The Europeans were using the Jovian calendar all throughout Europe, and the South American calendar was much more accurate, and it was adopted in Europe as well too. They had the zero that they started using in mathematics 1,000 years before it was independently discovered in the Mideast, and they had all the mathematics that we have today as well too, trigonometry, calculus, and algebra. The Mayans themselves had many, many advancements and interesting things. They had medical journals. They were doing brain surgery. They had dental implants, toothbrushes. They had universal health care and a hospital system, and they had nursing training systems as well. But they did have medical journals. They happened to have an alphabet and a language. Not a lot of the natives here did. They used oral history a lot of times, but they happened to. And they had books that they wrote and left behind. They were accordion-style books called codices. But in 1577, the Spanish, who I guess had pretty much extracted the information they wanted, they did make a law banning these because partly they were here to take over and they wanted to disrupt all local administration. So they made a law against these and they were all destroyed. There's 4 only left in the world today from pre-1492, these codices. But they had medical journals. They were writing a lot of this stuff down. They had sustainable ecology all up and down the 2 continents. And by that I mean we tend to think of them as not as this pristine wilderness, and they kept it in good shape, but they didn't change anything, which is a wrong idea that's out there. They really did change a lot, and they tended to treat the continents almost as their own garden, but making changes on a continental scale. And they did quite a bit in that area. So a little bit about gifts of ideas and thought now. That's my personal favorite area. My sub-passion is the Iroquois Confederacy and some of the North American indigenous people. Well, the Longhouse people, which we know as the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, contributed quite a lot to our ideas of gifts and thought. Now, the longhouses that they lived in, these were not little huts or shacks. They have excavations of longhouses 450 feet long and 50 feet across, so pretty good-sized buildings that they were able to construct. There's a person called the Great Peacemaker, and that's a great story. In 1142, so almost 900 years ago, he came to some of the Indians that were warring, and he introduced them to an idea of having this confederacy, an Iroquois confederacy. It was the world's first United Nations and the world's first democracy, which I'll get into in a few minutes. But we know what we know as the Six Nations, which was originally 5 nations. It was originally created to do away with war. And the historians have been now admitting for 60 or 70 years that the American Constitution is not based on anything from the land of kings and queens over in Europe, but it's based directly on the Iroquois Confederacy with the 2 houses, and there's many, many similarities. The difference was in the Iroquois Confederacy, they had 50 of people that met, and it had to be unanimous when they made a decision. But the Iroquois Confederacy was created to do away with war. The representatives were nominated and elected, and they could be removed from office. And that got a lot of attention from the nobility in Europe. Believe me, they sent plenty of spies over to find out about what this situation here where they could remove these people from office. So they knew very much about it. And Congress in the U.S., by the way, officially did recognize this in the 1980s. And I have a document that sometimes that I show that has that on there. So in the Iroquois Confederacy, people who were invited to always take refuge under the Tree of Peace. You've heard about the Tree of Peace, and burying the hatchet is still one of our expressions. It was always when someone insisted on using force, they were always given three opportunities and invited to come under the umbrella of the Tree of Peace and settle their differences by diplomacy, by counsel. And the English and French were invited to come under the Tree of Peace, or do their fighting in their own land across the ocean. But the Europeans had always settled their differences by war and not so much by discussion. So the Iroquois were not initially really a warlike people. And that fighting, by the way, was mostly over land that they were stealing, and that's pretty well documented fact. So wars were mostly all about the land. So now women's rights has its roots in the Iroquois Confederacy. This is, again, easily trackable information. But the suffragette movement, which started in the 1850s up to then eventually to 1910, women got the vote in Europe, in Britain, just before the First World War, and in the United States just after the First World War. So they were very closely associated with the Iroquois women, all of the initial suffragettes and the people who were going to Europe and having conferences back and forth between New England and England. And they all had a lot to say about the Iroquois, and the women of today really would be envious of the position of the Iroquois women. It was a matrilineal society that they ran. So that's something that we can trace back and treat as one of the contributions as well to our civilization today. Socialism and socialistic tendencies. Frederick Engels was the guy who wrote something very famous that caught a lot of attention, and people like Marx and Lenin followed his writings. He was in turn influenced greatly by Lewis Morgan's study of the Iroquois, and the Europeans were fascinated with the Iroquois. I wouldn't say with the North American Indian, I should say. I wouldn't say in a way where they thought of them as equals, and maybe they thought of them as animals, I'm not sure, but they certainly were fascinated with them. And a lot of the philosophers writing, Locke and Rousseau and these people, the idea of utopia came up at that time. They were heavily influenced by what was going on in this type of society that they had in North America. So it's well known that they were influenced by that. And also the role of men and women, because the philosophy with most native cultures was that women were the farmers and they gave life to people, so they gave life to the earth, and they were in charge of the earth, basically. Slavery was outlawed in all the Iroquois Confederacy and had been for almost 900 years. Make sure I'm on track here. So I'll go through just a few of things that they did not have in that society. Rape did not exist, so it was unnecessary to even have laws about rape. It was unheard of. Any stories about them raping prisoners have been all totally debunked. Now, all European societies had legalized wife beating and legalized marital rape at that time. Children's rights as well, something that we still don't have on our radar today even. Everybody had a say in the Iroquois Confederacy. Old people, young people as well too. At the age of reason, 14 years old, 15 years old, they had a say in the government. And that is a real democracy. So some of the checklist of things they did not have: rape, seduction, child abuse, sexual abuse, poor houses, no jails, theft, slavery, domination, or along with that is the idea of being dominated as well too. And again, Europeans were fascinated with that aspect. Gender inequality, no disease to speak of, really, no gallstones, kidney stones, asthma, obesity, no mistreatment of prisoners or massacres. These again have been debunked, that the Indians themselves did not perform massacres. A massacre meaning at the end of a battle, innocent people, especially women and children, are slaughtered. That's something they really didn't do. They didn't actually have a standing army. It was more of a militia setup. And they also did no fighting off of their own land, which I found surprising. Okay, so moving on a little bit here. So look at your own day today, and what do you love about our way of life? Well, the gifts of the American Indian are all around you. And remember that those contributions helped to form today's civilization. It wasn't that long ago we called this the white man civilization. I think we know better than that today. But all the peoples of the world, including the black people of Africa, because that's a whole other area that I could go into that I could study, because I know they have just as many of these invisible contributions. But Asians, Caucasians, everyone contributed equally to today's civilization. So how are we living today? How are we thinking and governing ourselves? Well, what food are we eating? What sort of, as I say, things like the Industrial Revolution that we're living with today were foundations of a lot of things that were given by a lot of different peoples. So let's look at a quick checklist of what they gave at that point, the Northern Indians: democracy, our sense of liberty and freedom, which they were fascinated with, and we still live with that today. When there's Arab Spring or when the German wall falls down, they'll tend to bring out these Americanisms, sing "We shall overcome" and those things. And that idea in people's mind of this liberty and freedom that's an American associated or Canadian associated thing, attributable back to the Iroquois Confederacy and some of these civilizations. So women's rights, children's rights, socialism, the first United Nations in the world. So another one of my favorite areas, the gifts of health. Let's look at some of the gifts of health that they contributed and gave to us. The idea of cleanliness, nutrition, fresh air, exercise, the medicines that I touched on before. Corn, sweet potato, and potato were all three really amazing contributions they gave. Now, corn and sweet potato in particular were world changers, and they did start traveling around the world very quickly after they were first discovered. Sweet potato and corn are a lot easier to grow. Barley and wheat are not that easy to grow, and the Europeans were amazed at the yields from corn, an acre of corn, the actual amount of food that came from it, because they had nothing like that. And rice, going elsewhere in the world, the other main staple, rice, was also very difficult to grow. Corn and sweet potato were very forgiving in terms of the soil, the amount of rainfall, growing on hills in particular. When it was introduced into China, one of the dynasties there instructed all the peasants in China to start growing sweet potato and corn, and that did transform China. They doubled their population in a period of about 150 years, attributable to sweet potato and corn, because most population booms in history are when people start being able to be fed and eating, and that's when then growth starts to happen. So the yields, we know about the three sisters, the nutritional makeup of the food was quite balanced. 75% of the foods grown in the world today were gifts of the American Indian. Now, if that isn't a magnificent contribution to today's civilization, I don't know what is. All the beans in the world today, except for two, the soya and the horse bean, which came from China, all the beans we have in the world today were a gift to the American Indian. And of course, we know beans have protein. It's a way to get protein in the plant world. The number of types of corns they had, 300 different types of corn, including that hybrid corn that the white man claims to have discovered in the middle of the 20th century. They had that corn as well, too. The number of types of potatoes, the potato came from the Andes. Still today, they have 6,000 different potatoes is how many. The scientists still don't exactly know how many species are involved with that. So the potato, what do we call the potato? We call it the Irish potato normally, right? And there's a lot of these types of misleading terms, foreign names that are attached to things. And before I get into that, there's one nation, the Inca nation of Peru, that gave 80 food plants to the world, over 80 food plants, more than all of Europe combined. All the Czechs, the Swiss, the English, the French, the Germans, the Poles, the Italians, all of them combined did not give as much as that one Indian nation to the world. So foreign names attached. Yeah, Egyptian cotton is one. They had the finest South Sea cotton. It's the finest cotton in the world. They thought it was silk when they first saw it. Egypt did have a crude short-haired cotton that's not grown commercially anywhere today. Egyptian cotton, India rubber, Jerusalem artichoke. I mentioned the Irish potato, the Italian tomato, Boston baked beans, Turkish tobacco, even the turkey itself, which of course was indigenous to North America. Madagascar bean, the French bean, the Italian bean, Burma bean, Belgian chocolate, Rangoon bean, Turkish bath, Hawaiian pineapple. Greek democracy is another one. Now the Greeks, everything good and great had to come from white man's land over there in Europe, so they'll look for something for a democracy with their magnifying glass desperately and frantically all over the continent, and they'll come up with that the Greeks had a democracy. Well, Greece, 75% of the people in Greece were slaves, first of all. The women were owned, they were chattel, they were property, so that takes care of another half the population. The old people had no say, the young people had no say. So certainly there was some men that were doing some votes, but kings and queens had quorums and did votes as well too, but that doesn't make it a democracy. And the United States was not a real democracy when it started, because they had slavery as well too for a long time. So just to repeat, one of the main premises that all Europeans and Indians were peers and co-equals initially, but then people forgot. So why not recast some worldviews and attitudes? Let's increase our understanding and help those around us, because the faulty attitudes are hurting us now. They're hurting you, they're hurting the next generation, in fact, too, yes. Now these inaccurate worldviews are ready to harm a whole new generation. But this time the harm is expected to be deep and widespread. And there's a shameful legacy that's about to be revealed. And psychologists are already advising school teachers as we speak now about how to handle, what to do at the end of these classes with these children, because they have a lot of questions and they want to know what's going on. A worldview, I see it as a set of images in our mind, really, and there's many, many examples. But I like the example of, let's say, look at the North American continent on the coastline, the Atlantic coast of the North American continent, and the picture in your mind, and it would just be, for most people, you just picture sort of wilderness if you're going up and down there in a ship. If you went up and down there in a ship in 1492, and many ships did go in the 1500s up and down there, and they didn't really do much until later on because the land was taken. What you would see wouldn't be wilderness. You would see towns, villages, smoke coming from chimneys. You'd see homes, cornfields 12, 15, 18 miles long. It was obvious that it was inhabited and there was people living there. So that's an example of a worldview. And I think how we see things is really just a combination, a whole bunch of collection of mental images in our mind. And that's why I like the idea that them being peers and co-equals. They lived together. They contributed back and forth with each other, but the information got forgotten. And it wasn't just a coincidence, too. It was partly that was done on purpose as well too. So I want to talk about disease. This gets a little bit technical here now. three aspects to what happened with the disease. Okay, first of all, the disease spread inland very, very quickly. And when I say disease, we're talking about two types of malaria. There's a second malaria that had a huge impact on world history, a malaria that stays inside a person's body and system for 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and it can suddenly flare up, and they may be down and out for 6 months at a time. So that's always been a part of all world history, but particularly large in the Western Hemisphere. Malaria, typhus, yellow fever, plague, influenza, tetanus, smallpox, diphtheria, measles, cholera, goiter, all introduced from Europe. And the diseases spread inland before the Europeans actually got there, and that's one of the things that has been lost and forgotten over time, or not realized until recently, the last 20, 30 years, that the disease spread so quickly inland that people were meeting societies that had already had the disease. Now in Europe, because of this immunization spectrum issue, an epidemic might sweep through Europe and 30% would be quite a bit, 40%, maybe 50% of the population wiped out. In all of the Americas, up and down, South America, Mesoamerica, North America, 70, 80% was common, 90%, sometimes 100%. So this immunization spectrum relates to how similar one person is to the next person. So possibly from the Bering Strait theory, not sure, but the DNA, when they check the DNA of indigenous peoples up and down the Western Hemisphere, their immunization spectrum is very, very narrow compared to anybody else on Earth. So it was a disaster waiting to happen. They were very similar one to another. And 80 and 90% of the population being wiped out was very, very common. So that's the one. The disease traveling inland before they actually met anybody. And then this immunization spectrum, which meant that they were going to get really hit hard with percentage-wise with getting wiped out. The third part is something called Holmberg's mistake. Holmberg was a gentleman actually from the 20th century. But all down through the centuries, what happened is they were fascinated with Indians in Europe, and this was being reported on, and people were reading about the Indians. And it was common for them to come and meet a town, village, territory, state, tribe that had recently been decimated down to perhaps 5%, maybe 15, 20 years before. So they were reporting on these savages and their primitive way of life, but you can imagine a civilization that's just been, or a town that's been wiped out down to 5% of their people. The hunting, the farming, everything goes. They really have no culture. They're just scrambling, trying to catch up. So this happened repeatedly, this Holmberg's mistake, and still exists a little bit today. So I think Europeans are taking an awful lot of credit that doesn't rightfully belong to them, like my democracy example. Reading wasn't invented by Europeans. Writing was not invented by Europeans. And arithmetic was not invented by Europeans. Those were all invented by a very dark-skinned people thousands of miles to the south and introduced up into Europe. All four races, as I mentioned before, have contributed to today's civilization. And the contributions on the good side, the Western Hemisphere people certainly contributed a lot on the good side, if you look at a good side and bad side list. So it's kind of time to rewrite the history books. The Indians put the white man on the map, really. They taught them how to live in these lands. They just had to turn their back and walk back into the woods, really, in a lot of cases. They taught their children, they gave their children food when they were hungry. They gave them fish, meat, and bread. They were always a very welcoming people. Right from the very, very first, Christopher Columbus's first manuscript, on the first page, you can see that, what he said about the people, how welcoming they were, what they have, they do not hesitate to give. This was all up and down the continents, and that's also very well documented. But the Europeans, they were here to colonize. They were settlers. They were adventurers, really. They were get-rich-quick people. They were here to get gold and silver and go back and report to the king and queen. And the Indians certainly welcomed them at the beginning, but then troubles set in. So some of the Eurocentric views that we have make it difficult. And I'm in the same boat myself, because to me an alphabet and a language, that's just basic, but there's a lot of cultures around the world who do not have languages and alphabets. So some of our ideas, like the way they did their animal meat, like there's only 42 domesticatable animals in the whole world, and the other landmass, they had camel, they had oxen, they had the horse. The last camels and horses disappeared in the last ice age in the North American, South America continent. Llama was the biggest animal that they had that was domesticatable. As I say, there's only 42 domesticatable animals in the world, and the llama and alpaca couldn't carry a full-grown person. They could just carry children. So they did what they did by hand tools and without the benefit. So we tend to think of things like that. The wheel is a good example. They had the wheel. Guess what they used it for? Children's toys. Now, it could be called one of the flukes of history, maybe, that they didn't utilize the wheel more, but they didn't have pack animals. They did a lot of their things by hand. I like the difference of the Mohawk language, where we have 3 tenses in our language. We have many more than that, but 3 basic tenses: past, future, and present. In the Mohawk language, they have 27 tenses built into their language. And when you ask a lot of the indigenous people, they don't tend to focus on the past. They didn't have years and that type of records. But the future is very much built into their language. And they made day-to-day decisions based on this 7 generations, which is about 200 years in the future. And that's built directly into many, many of these cultures, very foreign to Eurocentric thinking, where we're like, let's get going and do this stuff now. So some of the things are very confusing when we look at how they handle this. So I believe little children are not really being given a lot of the information. The stories are not proud. Columbus himself, there's statues to him all over the place. He was a slave trader. He was a mass murderer. You can't really sugarcoat it very easily with him. He was governor of Hispaniola, which is Dominican Republic today, and he ran it very ruthlessly. They would routinely bash babies against trees just to make a point and stuff like that. It was another world difficult for us to imagine. The religions are pretty well all guilty of making Indians ashamed of their people. And you can imagine if someone grows up ashamed of their own grandfather, that person is lost, and lost forever. And if you do that generation after generation, it's difficult to recover. Now, Alexander VI, who was a pope at that time, as early as 1493, so only 1 year later, they had these edicts that came down called inter cetera bulls, and they're still around today. And in 1493, he was asked to come up with some ruling on these people that they had found, because the kings and queens needed some direction, and he decided, okay, he gave them the go-ahead. So he said, yes, it's okay to subjugate these people and enslave them and to kill them if it was in the name of Christianity. So the Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, which were very concerned about that gave them more or less the go-ahead, the direction of what they could do. So when they sent their people over, they knew that it was okay to do that. Of course, they thought they were doing the right thing, just like we've been doing for 500 years. We always think we're doing the right thing, right? Just like today, they're not necessarily saying we're going to go and just be as brutal as we can. And certainly church people could be put into that category. The manifest destiny, which we all have heard and to do with North America, is a very similar situation. We have a God-given right to this land, and that becomes our justification for everything that we do, to what could be, try to avoid the G word, which is genocide, but I mean that went on up and down these continents. Or I call it, we've just passed a law that says we can break Indian treaties whenever we want. That kind of settles that issue. And for Canadians, I was surprised too. South Africa, when they brought in apartheid, which is going quite a ways back, they wanted to do it smoothly. They wanted to do it in a way that would be functional, so they went to do research around the world. And guess where they came? To see how they could set up their apartheid, they came to Canada. In Canada, the Indian Act, which we still have remnants of today, the India Act, it spells it out right in there. There's Indians and there's people. And anyway, that's something that the South Africans did. So I think we feel better when we're guilt-free. And what bothers me, people will let themselves deal with this guilt every day in the news when they could be free early. So let's deconstruct these lies. We'll create some truth and lead the life of understanding that you picture. So yeah, please help with this. I think help people understand the facts, help them understand truth, understand their world, understand their worldview, understand their own situation, and then understand their inner self and understand their inner soul as well too. So that's when we can achieve our own personal truth and reconciliation. Okay, so thank you.